Thank you, Sobs. And just letting you know as well, my name is Ulrich Löffler. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Ecosystem, so I've got the pleasure to facilitate the next session. I just wanted to say Sobs is available later on a panel at 4 p.m. as well. So if you have any questions around anything that he shared, please stick around, and we've got an open floor to address some of them. I also wanted to say, when I saw the video of the FinTech Festival, I had the pleasure or the honor of attending the last one in 2018, and I've got to say it's pretty mind-blowing. And I think last year was 45,000 people. This year I heard 60 or 70,000. So you really have got to be there. So if you can make it happen, I would really encourage you to come up to Singapore. Another one for later, we heard from Sobs on some of the initiatives happening in Singapore. We also have some other great speakers from Singapore who made their way down to New Zealand. One is actually a Kiwi, Jared McKenzie, who leads the innovation and transformation for one of the largest banks in Singapore. So we hear as well what he's doing, and obviously has from a banking perspective as well, maybe some encouraging words on what fintechs can do in the engagements with some of the large banks. We also heard earlier a lot about data, and especially when we talk about AI or leveraging the data economy, we first of all need to have the data to build our algorithms on top of that. So I'm really pleased not to lead into a panel where we want to talk about innovation based on trusted data. And to lead into the panel, I would like to introduce Dr. David Hardoon, who's a special advisor for artificial intelligence at the Monetary Authority of Singapore. He calls himself a data artist rather than a data scientist, which I think is a very nice angle of the AI part. He previously was the chief data officer at MAS, but he is now driving the AI strategy and collaboration strategy for the Singapore government. So please welcome Dr. David Hardoon.
Well, thank you very much, and thanks for that embarrassing plug. Yeah, I call myself a data artist for those two reasons that I mentioned earlier, that I still find the whole idea about data scientists just bizarre, given the fact that all scientists use data, even philosophers. But anyway, so as I was mentioning earlier, kind of using AI in a more ubiquitous term, I want to kind of take a step back and talk about data, because with all the conversation that we're having about facilitating the digital economy, fintech, startups, etc., and so forth, it all situates on the feasibility and the usability of data, be it from data moving across organizations, within organization, cross country, and so forth. And if we fundamentally are keen and interested in facilitating what we call as the digital economy, data has to flow. I mean, imagine a scenario whereby having such abilities of storing, processing, aggregating, or even transmitting data cannot happen. It's entirely antithesis to that of a digital economy. And one of the comments there from The Economist is that the world's most valuable resource is no longer oil, but data. And one of those, I don't know if any of you watched Dune, but the spice must flow. In this case, data must flow. So why are we talking about this, and why are we doing this? And it's actually a really interesting thing, given the fact that in Singapore currently, there actually is no limitations in terms of data flow and data usage. As long as obviously the requirements of a secure environment, privacy, and so forth is maintained. I take that as a hygiene, as a given. But as we all know, sometimes not saying you can do something results in a lot of organizations still not doing it. And if we look globally, oh, my slides are not moving. There is an underlying degree of various localization of data. From your non, which actually I'm very happy and proud to say Singapore sits within, all the way to the very strong requirements. And literally on top of my head, to give you some example, strong will obviously, for example, be your China. And until a day or 2 days ago, if indeed is true and not a typo error, Indonesia. And as Sobs was just mentioning earlier, they're fundamentally kind of reversed from requiring the very strong localization of data for financial sector, or in fact all sectors, to now saying that any private business in fact can do the processing of data overseas, with the exception of government-related data. And again, if in true, I've only found it in the Jakarta Times, it is a fundamental and phenomenal change. All the way to kind of from a de facto, which ironically is very interesting because I never thought it was intended to be that, is the EU and GDPR. It's kind of resulted in, from a business point of view, localizing EU kind of citizen-based data in the EU. India, Brazil, Argentina, Canada, on a specific segment. So in the end of the day, you're seeing this kind of degree of portfolio. Now, when discussing with financial institutions, well, the vast majority, it's never just a one-country business. It's a multinational, multi-institutional type of organization. And that's why I said that even not having any localization of data results in an operating process of kind of working at the highest or higher of a bar by saying, we can't have data going. And in fact, one of the biggest complaints I get, complaints or comments from tech companies, when I ask them, what is your challenges when you're working with fintech players, saying, I'm contracted to do a job for them, but they won't give me the data. And I always wonder, how does that even work? So you're paying someone to just look and kind of jump around it. So you're seeing, we need to move against this. As I mentioned earlier, if we really and fundamentally are trying to fulfill and establish a digital economy, this needs to happen. And I was just talking to someone the other day, and I was thinking, if you really go to a full strong, how do you send emails? Because that kind of moves between countries as well. So an example of kind of from a status quo as to why there's the need for it. And to be really honest, it's really interesting kind of putting this together. It also happens within organization, but now it's from a cross-institutional, cross-sovereignty perspective, where you may have multiple locations, data sitting there, and there are kind of two views that I take of it. Naturally, coming from a regulator, I look at it from a risk perspective. Where currently you may have a scenario whereby you're aggregating risk for country A, regulating risk for country B, and so forth, and then submitting it to the home regulator. But then that fundamentally is a different view. If you had the ability to analyze based on an entity or even based on an individual, cross the locations. Now that's one point of view. Naturally, there's immense possibilities on the services side if you have an ability of how I perform. Just because I moved from Singapore to New Zealand doesn't change me as a person in the type of services I'm interested in. Or, of course, from a tech company perspective, if there's an inability of working across these locations, you need to physically be in every single one of these locations. So how to effectively go about in managing from your financial crimes, and again, I have a massive biasness to that, coming from the regulatory perspective, all the way to the services, marketing, and the engagement. We need to think differently. We need to see how we situate around an activity, around an entity, around an individual, independent of the location. There we go. Now, there's various approaches that, in fact, we have been exploring in Singapore, and I think across the board, in terms of addressing it. So the first one is, being a tech person, obviously a technical solution. And the kind of three things that we've experimented are in terms of, it's actually quite interesting, you know, if a tree falls in the forest, but you can't see the tree, you can't even see the forest, has the tree fall down? So this was basically being a smart ass and said, okay, so I can't move data across borders. Can we still analyze data without moving the data across borders? So various kinds of techniques, homomorphic encryption, tokenization, multi-party secure computation, as well as federated analytics, where the whole idea is that data that's really sensitive and moving about, can we think of ways in effectively making it meaningless for layman person point of view, but still allows us to analyze it, still allows us to achieve certain outcomes from it. A recent pilot, and this is public, that was done by UOB and MAS and the Bank of Thailand were observers, where it's quite interesting is on the federated analytics, where the analytical algorithm goes to the data rather than data going to the algorithm, and then the outcome comes back. But as you can imagine, while there are these technological solutions and approaches in dealing with this issue of data flow effectively, there are two underlying issues still. One is you need to train up people. It's new tech. Even just people always ask, like, what the hell is homomorphic encryption and so forth? How do you deal with it? And then, of course, there's that legal challenge that's on top of it. Because A, as I gave the analogy about the tree falling in the forest but no one sees it, well, even though you're not moving the original data or if you change the form, something is still moving. Does it pass the legal threshold? Or the fact that there's always that requirement that there's 0% likelihood of being reinterpreted. Now, we all know there's never 100% likelihood of not reinterpreting it. So does it pass the legal barrier associated with it? But still exploring, still needs to be done. Concurrently to that, and that's what we've been advocating over the last, I would say, nearly a year in Singapore, dealing it across organizations and across countries, New Zealand included, is how do we take our trade agreements and upgrade them effectively? Really thinking with a digital economy in the mindset of every folks. So how do we create an environment whereby a financial institution in country A and a company located B, or it could be even the same financial institution in country B, does not need to have that physical connectivity, physically in the presence in the same country to do whatever analysis? So I'll give you an example. You may have an NLP-based company, natural language processing company based in New Zealand that's providing services to an OCBC or DBS or UOB in Singapore. And not having the necessity of saying, well, you need to uplift, go all the way to Singapore to providing that underlying service, because at the end of the day, you contracted to do that. How do we facilitate that? And how do we provide that comfort to the financial institutions that it's kosher, and also for the tech companies? Now, at the same time, is providing those safeguards for the regulators that this is indeed data, that is Singapore data, and I have the access to it whenever I need it. So it's really thinking differently, or not so differently, because we've had embassies for, well, quite some time, if not millennia. Same idea in a digital concept. In fact, and again, to give you a concrete example, but I don't think it's still been ratified, if you look at the Canadian, US, Mexican trade agreement, that's exactly the wording that's in those agreements. They've moved from, I think it was the US Treasury, from how can we allow data that's critical for the US economy to be sitting not in the US, to actually consider anyway, as long as we, from a regulatory perspective, have the ability to access it and it's protected. That's the way we need to start thinking. That's the way we need to start moving effectively. And that's what we're advocating. That's what we're driving, in allowing and facilitating the growth. And I was just having a conversation outside, talking about talent and facilitating talent across the world. Even if you've taken everyone who does data science, everyone who does AI, and stacked them up all together, that's still not enough people globally to address the demand that's available. So we need to start thinking in the way that how do we truly proliferate, how do we truly allow for the facilitation to leverage on all the data assets that we have through the people and the organizations out there. Because quite frankly, and this is also the coming of age for a lot of the legacy systems and the legacy or brick and mortar organizations, we don't collect data to just hug it at night and feel good about it. There needs to be an underlying value and an outcome that comes from it. The honest truth is, and this is I always say with a smile when I speak to compliance people at financial institutions, saying, the only reason you collect data is because I made you, from a regulatory perspective. But now we need to change that. Think about that data that's being collected, how to use it and how to leverage. Oh, I think that's my last, oh yeah, it's my slide. So just to wrap up, even though in Singapore, as I mentioned, we're at the bottom of the pillar and we don't actually require any of these agreements, and actually going to one of the points that Sub was mentioning earlier about the sandbox, I don't know it's about whether it's doing things that we don't need to do, but it's about providing that comfort and familiarity for both financial institutions as well as tech players that even though I don't need to do this agreement, even though I don't need to have this because you can just go ahead and do it, I'm providing you that safety in terms of you can do it. You can facilitate this. You can provide these underlying services. Going down the path of advocating and driving that innovation. And it's again hand to hand in terms of the mantra and the approach that from an MAS and in Singapore as a whole we take, is that innovation and regulations are not contradictory to one another. There's always this prevailing view that for innovation you have to downplay regulation, or if you have regulations you don't achieve innovation. It's that the fundamentally good regulation allows a proliferation of innovation. And this is one aspect that we're trying to fulfill from Singapore point of view. So, thanks.
Thank you, David. Don't move too fast, so you can stay.